Welcome to Plotfall. Today, we'll unravel the surprisingly complex tapestry of life as a medieval king. The heavy weight of St. Edward's crown pressed down, a physical manifestation of the invisible burden now settling upon the young king's shoulders. Incense choked the air of Westminster Abbey, the chanting of monks a hypnotic drone against the vibrant tapestry of nobles assembled. Sunlight, fractured by stained glass, painted the scene in ethereal hues, but the newly crowned monarch felt no warmth. He saw not the admiring gazes, but the weight of expectation in every eye. This was no fairy tale ascension. This was the beginning of a life lived under constant scrutiny, a life shackled by duty. And so it was. The king, elevated above all others, was paradoxically the least free. Every decision, every uttered word, carried the weight of the crown. His personal desires, his very individuality, were subsumed by the demands of the realm. Could he indulge in a simple pleasure, a hunt in the royal forests, without considering the political implications? Could he choose a wife based on love, or must she be a pawn in a game of alliances and inheritances? The records tell us of kings who yearned for normalcy, for the simple life of a farmer or a blacksmith, yet they were trapped in gilded cages of their own making. Consider this. Even the most mundane aspects of life were dictated by royal protocol. The king's meals were elaborate ceremonies, his sleep carefully monitored by a retinue of servants. His privacy was a myth, constantly surrounded by advisors, courtiers, and guards, each with their own agendas and whispers. One can only piece together the psychological toll of such an existence. Imagine never truly being alone, never being able to express a thought without it being dissected and analyzed. The crown, symbol of ultimate power, was also a symbol of profound isolation. The very act of ascending the throne meant sacrificing a part of oneself, a trade-off that few truly understood until the weight of the world rested upon their heads. Where was the man beneath the crown? This is the question we must explore. Where was the man beneath the crown? For young Edward, barely a man, the crown felt less like a symbol of power and more like a cage. Thrust onto the throne at the tender age of 14 after his father's sudden demise, Edward was ill-prepared for the weight of the kingdom he now inherited. He had known a childhood of relative freedom, of falconry and swordplay, not of councils and decrees. The vibrant tapestries of the royal court, once a backdrop to games of hide-and-seek, now seemed to mock him with their depictions of stern-faced kings and glorious battles he had only read about. The records tell us of a boy king, lost in a world of whispers and intrigue. His advisors, seasoned veterans of courtly life, spoke in veiled terms, their words heavy with implications he struggled to grasp. Every smile seemed calculated, every gesture measured. He yearned for the familiar comfort of his childhood companions, but they were kept at a distance, replaced by a constant entourage of unfamiliar faces. He was surrounded, yet utterly alone. Edward's naivete, once a charming innocence, became a dangerous liability in this new world. He trusted too easily, offered forgiveness too readily. The court, a viper's nest of ambition and rivalry, sensed his vulnerability. And so it was that the boy who had dreamed of knightly quests and heroic deeds found himself trapped in a different kind of battle, one fought not with swords, but with whispers and veiled threats. One can only piece together the apprehension that must have gnawed at him as he sat upon the throne. The heavy crown, a constant reminder of the responsibilities he was so unprepared to bear. What would become of this young king, caught in the currents of a world he barely understood? The dawn of his reign broke not with the clarion call of trumpets, but with a hushed, almost suffocating stillness. He awoke in the royal chambers, the unfamiliar weight of the crown pressing against his temples, a dull ache echoing the immense pressure settling upon his young shoulders. The records tell us that the first day of a medieval king was rarely a triumphant procession. Instead, it was an onslaught, a deluge of information designed to overwhelm and subdue. Consider this. A boy, barely a man, suddenly thrust into the role of ultimate arbiter, the final voice in matters of life, death, and the fate of an entire kingdom. A procession of advisors, each with their own agenda and veiled ambition, filled his chambers. They came bearing reports from far-flung corners of the realm, news of skirmishes on the borders, whispers of peasant unrest, the intricate dance of alliances and betrayals amongst the nobility. Each advisor sought to mold the young king to their own design, their words like silken threads weaving a cage of influence around him. One spoke of the urgent need to strengthen the defenses of the northern marches. Another emphasized the importance of appeasing a powerful, disgruntled duke. Each voice clamored for his attention, each vying to plant their seed of counsel in the fertile ground of his inexperience. He listened, struggling to absorb the torrent of information, the sheer volume of it threatening to drown him. The faces blurred, the voices merging into a cacophony of anxieties and demands. One can only imagine the confusion that must have clouded his thoughts. The desperate yearning for a familiar face. A trusted voice amidst the sea of unfamiliar faces and honeyed words. He was a king, yes, but also a boy, adrift in a world suddenly grown too large, too complex, too treacherous. How could he, so young, so untested, possibly navigate this labyrinth of power and intrigue? And what terrible mistakes might he make along the way? And so it was. The weight of the crown began to settle, not upon his head, but upon his very soul. The initial thrill of processions and pronouncements faded, replaced by a relentless tide of parchment, decrees, land disputes, pleas for justice, each one a miniature drama unfolding on his desk. He'd imagined glorious battles, the clang of steel, the thunder of hooves. Instead, he found himself battling the scratch of the quill, the endless blotches of ink staining his fingers a permanent blue. The sheer volume of paperwork was staggering. Each document demanded his attention, his signature, his judgment. He'd spend hours hunched over the heavy oak table, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. One can only piece together the mounting frustration he must have felt, the gnawing sense of inadequacy creeping into his young heart. He was expected to understand complex legal arguments, intricate feudal relationships, the subtle nuances of diplomacy. Yet, just a few short years ago, his greatest concern had been mastering the falcon's flight, not the flight of a kingdom. Consider this. Every scribe had their own unique hand, each scroll a labyrinth of archaic script and unfamiliar terminology. Some were penned neatly, others a frantic scrawl, reflecting the urgency of the matter contained within. Petitions arrived from every corner of the kingdom, each bearing its own tale of woe or injustice. Stolen livestock, contested inheritances, accusations of witchcraft. The litany of human misery seemed endless. The records tell us that many kings, particularly the young ones, felt overwhelmed by this constant barrage of human drama. The boy, now king, found himself trapped in a gilded cage of responsibility. The heavy velvet curtains of the royal chambers offered little solace, only muffling the distant clamor of the court. Sleep became a luxury, often interrupted by nightmares of endless scrolls, their words twisting into accusations, their ink staining his hands a guilty red. He yearned for the simplicity of his former life, the freedom of the open fields, the companionship of his childhood friends. But that life was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of a kingdom resting squarely on his still developing shoulders. What toll would this relentless pressure take on him? And would he, in time, find a way to navigate this sea of parchment and emerge a true king? The weight of the crown extended far beyond the physical. It pressed down on every moment, every interaction, dictating the rhythm of his days. Court life, a swirling vortex of elaborate rituals and ceaseless ceremony, consumed him. Each morning began not with the rising sun, but with the arrival of his chamberlain, ushering in a procession of servants to dress him in heavy robes, each layer symbolic of his power, each stitch a reminder of his responsibility. Breakfast was a public affair, a carefully choreographed performance for the assembled nobles, every bite scrutinized, every word weighed. The records tell us of kings who barely tasted their food, so preoccupied were they with the constant observation. And so it was, day after day. An endless stream of audiences, petitions, and counsels filled his hours. One can only piece together the sheer exhaustion that must have settled in, the longing for a moment of true solitude. Even within his private chambers, privacy remained elusive. Servants hovered, attending to his needs, whispers of court intrigue seeping through the tapestries. The very walls seemed to have ears. Imagine the crushing weight of this constant scrutiny, the inability to ever truly be alone with one's thoughts. Consider this. Even the simplest acts like bathing or retiring for the night were transformed into elaborate rituals. Imagine being undressed and bathed by servants, every inch of your body exposed to the eyes of others. Where was the space for reflection? Where was the freedom to simply be? The line between king and prisoner blurred, the gilded cage a constant reminder of the price of power. He was a king, yes, but also a captive of his own court. This relentless performance, this constant demand for his attention, would shape him, mold him. But into what? The relentless performance continued day after day, dictated by a rigid, unyielding schedule. Dawn would break, not with the gentle caress of sunlight, but with the hushed whispers of servants preparing him for the day. The king's routine, seemingly glamorous from afar, was a carefully orchestrated performance, a play enacted for the benefit of the court and, ultimately, the kingdom. Each hour was meticulously planned, each movement imbued with symbolic meaning. One can only piece together the weight of such a life from fragmented historical accounts. The records tell us that the king's day often began with prayers in his private chapel, followed by a meeting with his closest advisors. Here, in the supposed quiet of the morning, the weight of the crown truly pressed down. Decisions impacting the lives of thousands rested on his shoulders, each whispered counsel carrying the potential for prosperity or ruin. There was little room for personal reflection, the needs of the kingdom always taking precedence. Imagine the constant pressure, the never-ending stream of petitions, reports, and requests. Next came the public audiences. The throne room doors would swing open, revealing a tableau of nobles, petitioners, and foreign dignitaries, each vying for the king's attention, each with their own agenda. The king, the arbiter of justice, the dispenser of favors, the symbol of stability, had to maintain an air of composure, of regal detachment, even as the human within him yearned for respite. The day continued with ceremonial duties, perhaps the blessing of a new knight, the signing of a treaty, or the presiding over a feast. Every action was a performance, a ritual designed to reinforce the king's authority, his divine right to rule. Even meals were a public affair, a carefully choreographed ballet of servers, tasters, and elaborate etiquette. And as the sun finally began to set, casting long shadows across the castle walls, the king would finally retire to his chambers. But even here, in the supposed privacy of his own rooms, the performance continued. The undressing, the washing, the preparations for sleep, all conducted under the watchful eyes of servants. The king, even in moments of vulnerability, was never truly alone. He was a king, yes, but at what cost? The king's table, laden with roasted meats, spiced wines, and elaborate sugar sculptures, was a spectacle of abundance. Imagine platters piled high with game birds, glistening with rich sauces, and fragrant loaves of freshly baked bread. This, one might think, was the reward of kingship, a daily indulgence in the finest the kingdom had to offer. But the reality was far more nuanced. One can only piece together the truth behind the lavish facade. Yes, the feasts were opulent, the aromas intoxicating. But beneath the surface of celebration simmered a constant tension. Every bite the king took was preceded by a taster, cautiously sampling the food for any hint of poison. Consider this. Each offered dish, each proffered cup, a potential threat. The king, surrounded by the bounty of his kingdom, was simultaneously imprisoned by it. His every meal a precarious dance between pleasure and paranoia. And the feasts were not merely occasions for sustenance, they were political theater. Who sat closest to the king? Who was granted the honor of serving him wine? These seemingly small gestures carried immense weight, signifying favor and influence within the court. Alliances were forged and broken over trenchers of roasted boar. Enemies smiled politely while plotting betrayals beneath the flickering candlelight. The records tell us that even the seating arrangements were meticulously planned, reflecting the delicate balance of power. A slight shift in placement could send ripples of anxiety through the assembled nobles. A whispered conversation, a pointed glance, all carefully observed and interpreted. The king's meal was not simply a time to eat. It was a battlefield where influence was won and lost. And so it was, that even in moments of apparent leisure, the king's burden of power was ever present. A constant weight pressing down upon him, even as he lifted the jeweled goblet to his lips. He was a king, surrounded by abundance, yet perpetually starving for true peace. Even the king's sleep offered little respite from the demands of his position. His chamber, far from being a private sanctuary, was often a semi-public space. Imagine the grand bedchamber, richly adorned with tapestries and furs, seemingly a picture of regal comfort. Yet, this space was rarely truly his own. The records tell us that courtiers and servants often had access, attending to his needs throughout the night. Noblemen might seek an audience before he even rose, their hushed requests and whispered anxieties filling the air before dawn. Consider this. The very architecture of the royal chamber reflected the king's vulnerability. Large fireplaces, necessary for warmth in drafty castles, provided multiple entry points. Secret passages, concealed behind tapestries or within the thick stone walls, might exist, remnants of past intrigues and ever-present reminders of potential threats. Sleep for a medieval king was rarely sound. He rested surrounded by the whispers of his court, the crackling of the fire, and the weight of his responsibilities. One can only piece together the king's mindset in those quiet, dark hours. Was he ever truly alone with his thoughts? Or was the constant presence of others a comfort, a shield against the loneliness of power? Did he dream of battles won and alliances forged, or of the ever-present threat of betrayal and insurrection? The king's bedchamber, a stage for both public display and private vulnerability, offered a glimpse into the complex reality of medieval kingship. It was a space where power and vulnerability intertwined, a constant reminder that even in the supposed sanctuary of sleep, the king was never truly free. What kind of toll did this constant pressure take on the man beneath the crown? We'll explore that next. The weight of the crown wasn't merely physical. It pressed down with the burdens of an entire kingdom, the lives of countless subjects resting upon the king's decisions, and those decisions rarely made in isolation. Surrounding the king was a court, a swirling vortex of advisors, each with their own agendas, subtly nudging the monarch towards their preferred course. One can only piece together the whispers and intrigues that filled the palace halls. Imagine the Lord Chancellor, a man of the church, advocating for peace and piety, his eyes fixed on the kingdom's spiritual well-being, perhaps even the expansion of the church's own power. Then picture the Earl Marshal, battle-hardened and ambitious, pushing for military expansion, seeing glory and land as the true measures of a king's reign. And what of the king's own family, brothers and uncles vying for influence, their loyalties sometimes questionable, their ambitions often masked beneath a veneer of familial concern? These competing voices created a constant tension, a subtle war fought not with swords and shields, but with whispered words and carefully crafted arguments. The king, the supposed apex of power, often found himself a pawn in these intricate games of influence. Did he trust the pious words of the chancellor, or the pragmatic advice of the marshal? Did he favor his kin, risking accusations of nepotism, or alienate them, potentially creating a breeding ground for resentment and rebellion? The very structure of the court, designed to support and advise the king, became a stage for these power struggles. Every royal decree, every appointment, every alliance forged, was the result of this complex interplay of personalities and agendas. Consider this. The king's every move was scrutinized, interpreted, and used to further the ambitions of those around him. The king's life, even within the supposed sanctuary of his own court, was a constant negotiation, a tightrope walk between the desires of his advisors and the needs of his kingdom. What chance did he have of truly ruling independently when every decision was shaped by the machinations of others? The whispers began subtly. Lord Aethelred, the king's seemingly unassuming advisor on matters of trade and diplomacy, possessed a talent for planting seeds of doubt. Never outright accusations, but carefully worded observations, seemingly innocuous questions posed at just the right moment. He was a master of insinuation, capable of turning the king's perception of his most trusted allies without ever appearing disloyal himself. He understood the power of fear, and he wielded it like a finely honed blade. The king, initially wary of Aethelred's quiet demeanor, gradually found himself relying on his counsel. Aethelred had a knack for framing complex issues in simple terms, presenting solutions that seemed both logical and beneficial to the crown. He spoke of potential threats, both real and imagined, weaving narratives of conspiracies and betrayals that preyed on the king's insecurities. The records tell us that the king, already burdened by the weight of his responsibilities, found solace in Aethelred's seemingly unwavering loyalty and clear-sighted advice. One can only piece together the true extent of Aethelred's influence. He began by subtly discrediting the king's long-standing chancellor, a man known for his unwavering honesty and dedication to the kingdom. Aethelred would casually mention rumors of the chancellor's secret meetings with foreign emissaries, hinting at clandestine agreements and undisclosed alliances. He would question the chancellor's financial decisions, suggesting impropriety and mismanagement. Slowly, drop by insidious drop, Aethelred poisoned the king's mind against his most trusted advisor. The king, isolated and increasingly paranoid, began to see enemies where there were none. And so it was that the chancellor, once the king's closest confidant, found himself stripped of his title and banished from the court. Aethelred, of course, expressed his deep regret at the unfortunate turn of events, all the while consolidating his own power and influence within the royal circle. With the chancellor gone, who would be next to fall victim to Aethelred's machinations? The stage was set, the pieces in place, and the king, unknowingly, had become a puppet in the hands of his most trusted advisor. The king's piety was, of course, unquestionable. A devout Christian, Aethelred attended Mass regularly, donated generously to the church, and consulted with bishops on matters both spiritual and secular. But the relationship between crown and cross was a delicate dance, a constant negotiation between earthly power and divine authority. The church, a powerful entity in its own right, held sway over the hearts and minds of the people. It commanded vast tracts of land, collected tithes, and wielded the formidable weapon of excommunication. Consider this. A king, however powerful, could not rule effectively without the church's blessing. Aethelred understood this implicitly. He needed the church to legitimize his rule, to sanctify his decisions, to quell dissent among his subjects. He needed the archbishop's support, not just spiritually, but politically. One can only piece together the pressures he faced, the constant push and pull between his own desires and the demands of the church. The archbishop, a shrewd and ambitious man, was well aware of his leverage. He pressed the king on matters of religious reform, demanding stricter adherence to church doctrine and greater financial contributions to religious institutions. He reminded Aethelred of his sacred duty to uphold the faith, to defend the church against its enemies, both within and without the kingdom. Were these truly requests, or thinly veiled commands? The line blurred. And so it was, that the king, caught between the hammer of his ambition and the anvil of the church's demands, found himself making concessions he might not have otherwise considered. Lands were granted, privileges bestowed, and royal decrees issued, all in the name of appeasing the archbishop and securing the church's continued support. But at what cost? Each concession chipped away at the king's authority, subtly shifting the balance of power towards the church. The seeds of resentment, sown in the fertile ground of compromise, began to take root, threatening to blossom into open conflict. The king's piety, once a source of strength, was slowly becoming a shackle, binding him to the will of the church. The uneasy truce between crown and crozier couldn't last. The archbishop, emboldened by the king's previous concessions, demanded the appointment of bishops within the realm, a right traditionally held by the king. This was a bridge too far. To cede this power would be to surrender a fundamental aspect of royal authority, transforming him into a mere puppet of the church. The king, his patience worn thin, refused. The archbishop, a man as skilled in political maneuvering as he was in theological debate, retaliated swiftly. He invoked the interdict, a devastating spiritual weapon that forbade the performance of religious services within the king's lands. Churches fell silent, the bells no longer tolled, and the sacraments, vital to the spiritual well-being of the people, were withheld. Fear and unrest gripped the kingdom. The people, deprived of their spiritual comfort, murmured against their king. Even the king's closest advisors, fearing divine retribution, urged him to yield. Consider this: the king, a warrior who had faced down rebellions and foreign invasions, now found himself besieged by an enemy he couldn't fight with swords and shields. The interdict was a weapon that targeted not the body, but the soul, creating a climate of fear and uncertainty that eroded the very foundation of his rule. One can only piece together the turmoil that must have consumed him, trapped between his duty to his people and his unwillingness to compromise the sovereignty of his crown. The pressure mounted. Isolated and increasingly desperate, the king wrestled with his conscience. To defy the church was to risk eternal damnation, a terrifying prospect even for a king. But to surrender was to diminish the crown, setting a dangerous precedent for future generations. The records tell us little of the king's inner struggles during this period, but we can imagine the sleepless nights, the whispered prayers, the agonizing deliberations that must have taken place within the cold stone walls of his castle. The conflict had escalated, a silent war fought not on the battlefield, but within the hearts and minds of the people, a war that the king could not afford to lose. And so it was, the weight of the crown pressed not just upon the king's brow, but upon his very soul. The silent war with the church had drained the royal treasury, a slow bleed that threatened to cripple the kingdom. The coffers, once overflowing, now echoed with the ghostly clinking of a few remaining coins. Managing the kingdom's finances was a constant tightrope walk, a perilous balance between the needs of the realm and the ever-present threat of bankruptcy. Consider this: every royal decree, every military campaign, every feast held in the Great Hall came at a cost. Taxes, the lifeblood of the kingdom, were a constant source of tension. Too high, and the people grumbled, their loyalty strained. Too low, and the royal purse remained empty, leaving the kingdom vulnerable. The king's advisors, men with furrowed brows and ink-stained fingers, constantly presented him with ledgers and accounts, each page a testament to the precarious state of the royal finances. The threat of bankruptcy loomed large, a specter haunting the king's every waking moment. A bankrupt king was a powerless king, unable to defend his realm, unable to enforce his laws, unable to maintain the delicate balance of power that kept his throne secure. He was forced to make difficult choices, to weigh the immediate needs against the long-term consequences. Should he invest in new fortifications to protect against invaders, or appease the restless nobles with lavish gifts? Should he fund the construction of a new cathedral to appease the church, or strengthen the royal army? One can only piece together the king's anxieties through fragmented records and the whispers of court historians. He walked a lonely path, burdened by the responsibility of an entire kingdom. The crown, a symbol of power and glory, also served as a constant reminder of the immense financial burden he carried. The fear of failure, of leaving his kingdom weaker than he inherited it, gnawed at him, a constant companion in the cold, echoing halls of power. What measures would he resort to stave off the looming financial crisis? And what would be the ultimate cost of his decisions? The fear of an empty treasury weighed heavier than any crown. The kingdom needed resources, and the unavoidable answer often lay in raising taxes. But this was a dangerous game, a precarious balancing act between the kingdom's needs and the people's capacity to bear the burden. Consider this: every additional coin levied was a coin taken from a farmer's meager harvest, a merchant's hard-earned profit, a family's dwindling store. The king knew this. He understood the delicate fabric of his realm, how easily it could tear. Raising taxes was not simply a matter of royal decree. It was a calculated risk, fraught with the potential for unrest. The records tell us of instances where even a slight increase in taxes led to widespread discontent, simmering resentment boiling over into open rebellion. Imagine the king, poring over the kingdom's accounts, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on his worried face. He could almost hear the murmurs of discontent in the distant villages, feel the rising tide of anger threatening to engulf his reign. Economic hardship was a breeding ground for dissent. A hungry populace was a volatile one, easily swayed by whispers of revolution and promises of a better life. And so it was the king's advisors cautioned him, reminding him of past uprisings, of the blood spilled in the name of fairer taxes. They spoke of the devastation wrought by these rebellions. Not just the loss of life, but the disruption of trade, the destruction of property, the lingering fear that poisoned the well of community. One can only piece together the king's dilemma. To raise taxes was to invite potential rebellion, to cripple his own people. But to not raise taxes was to leave the kingdom vulnerable, unable to fund its defenses, support its infrastructure, or weather unforeseen calamities. The crown, once a symbol of power, began to feel like a cage, trapping him between two equally perilous paths. Which path would he choose? And what would be the ultimate consequence of his decision? The weight of the crown pressed heavily, not just from its physical presence, but from the crushing burden of responsibility it represented. The king's anxieties extended far beyond the treasury. The parchment maps, spread across the war room table, spoke a different language of concern. The language of troop movements, fortified towns, and potential invasion routes. The threat of war, a constant shadow in the medieval world, loomed large. Imagine the sleepless nights spent strategizing, poring over reports from scouts and spies, wrestling with the terrible calculus of warfare. Preparing for war was a monumental undertaking, a complex dance of logistics and diplomacy. Raising an army wasn't simply a matter of issuing a royal decree. The feudal system, a web of obligations and allegiances, dictated who owed the king military service, and for how long. Consider this. Knights, bound by oaths of fealty, would answer the call, bringing their own retinues of men-at-arms and squires. But equipping and provisioning such a force, horses, armor, weapons, food, and shelter, strained even the wealthiest kingdoms. And so it was. The king found himself balancing the need for a strong defense with the economic realities of his realm. The constant threat of invasion cast a long shadow over every royal decision. Defensive fortifications, from imposing stone castles to humble wooden palisades, demanded constant upkeep. The king had to maintain a delicate balance. Invest too heavily in defense and risk crippling the economy. Invest too little and leave the kingdom vulnerable to opportunistic neighbors. The records tell us of kings who poured their fortunes into elaborate fortifications, only to face rebellion from an overtaxed populace. Others, seeking to avoid such unrest, neglected their defenses and paid the ultimate price: invasion, conquest, and the loss of their crown. The king, staring at the map, understood this precarious balance all too well. What good was a full treasury if the walls were crumbling and the enemy at the gates? The map, a tapestry of parchment and ink, offered no easy answers. The neighboring kingdom, emboldened by a recent succession crisis, had begun testing the borders, raiding villages and disrupting trade. War, it seemed, was inevitable. But war was not simply lines drawn on a map. It was a logistical nightmare of staggering complexity. Consider this. An army marches on its stomach. Thousands of men and their horses required an immense amount of food, grain, livestock, salted meat, all of which had to be procured, transported, and preserved, a feat requiring a vast network of carts, wagons, and roads. And what of the weapons? Swords, spears, armor, each piece meticulously crafted by blacksmiths working day and night. The king envisioned the columns snaking across the land, leaving a trail of dust and apprehension in their wake. He saw the weary faces of his soldiers, burdened not only by their equipment but also by the constant threat of ambush, disease, and desertion. One can only piece together the fear that gnawed at them, the knowledge that each sunrise could bring them face to face with death. The chronicles rarely speak of the dysentery that ravaged encampments or the terror of a nighttime raid, but these were the grim realities of medieval warfare. And then there was the moral cost, a burden the king carried heavily. He understood that the lines on the map represented not just territory, but lives. Every village razed, every soldier slain, weighed upon his conscience. Victory, if it came, would be bittersweet, purchased at a terrible price. He thought of the farmers forced to abandon their fields, the families torn apart, the futures extinguished. The king knew he had a duty to protect his kingdom, but the weight of that responsibility felt crushing. He stared at the map, the lines blurring before his eyes, and a chilling question echoed in his mind. Was he leading his people to salvation or to ruin? The weight of the crown pressed down not only in times of war, but in peace as well. For the king, the war room transformed into a courtroom. His maps of strategic advance were replaced with pleas for justice, whispered accusations, and the tangled webs of feudal obligations. Consider this. Dispensing justice in the medieval world wasn't a simple matter of right and wrong. It was a delicate dance of maintaining order, appeasing powerful nobles, and somehow, against all odds, avoiding the ever-present lure of corruption. One can only piece together the complexities of medieval law from fragmented records. The king, often illiterate himself, relied on scribes and advisors to interpret ancient laws, local customs, and, of course, the ever-shifting political winds. Imagine a peasant accused of stealing from a lord. A seemingly simple case, perhaps. But what if that lord was a powerful duke? Vital to the king's military strength, could true justice be served? Or would political expediency win out? The king listened to the testimonies, the pleas, the carefully crafted arguments. He watched the faces of the accused, the accusers, the whispering courtiers in the shadows, and he knew, with a heavy heart, that his judgment would have repercussions far beyond the individuals involved. A harsh sentence could spark a rebellion. Leniency could be seen as weakness. The scales of justice were rarely balanced, constantly tilting under the pressure of external forces. And so it was that the king struggled not just with questions of guilt and innocence, but with the very fabric of his kingdom. Every judgment, every pardon, every execution was a thread in that fabric, and a single misstep could unravel the delicate tapestry he was so desperately trying to preserve. The threat of corruption loomed large, whispering promises of wealth and power in exchange for favorable rulings. Could he remain impartial, dispensing justice fairly when surrounded by so much temptation? He closed his eyes, the weight of his crown a physical ache, and prayed for wisdom, for guidance, for the strength to uphold his sacred oath. The fate of his kingdom, he realized, rested not only on the battlefield, but within the hushed confines of his own court. The morning light, filtered through stained glass, cast long, colorful shadows across the throne room. A hush fell over the assembled court as the heavy oak doors creaked open, admitting a young woman, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She clutched a worn, blood-stained tunic to her chest. This was Elara, a farmer's daughter, accused of taking the life of a nobleman. The nobleman, Lord Eric, had been found dead near her family's farm, a single dagger wound piercing his heart. Circumstantial evidence pointed squarely at Elara, but she swore her innocence, her voice trembling as she recounted her alibi. She claimed to have been miles away, tending her ailing father. No witnesses could corroborate her story. The records told us Lord Eric was known for his cruelty, his harsh treatment of those who worked his lands. Whispers circulated of unpaid debts, of land unjustly seized, of Elara's family driven to desperation. And so it was, the king found himself at a crossroads, the weight of his judgment pressing heavily upon him. Could he condemn a seemingly innocent woman based solely on circumstantial evidence? Or did he dare risk appearing weak, undermining the very law he was sworn to uphold? The court buzzed with speculation. The nobles, clad in their finery, watched with hawk-like eyes, eager for a swift and decisive verdict. They saw in Elara a threat to their established order, a symbol of the peasantry daring to rise against their betters. Justice for them was a simple matter of maintaining the status quo. But the king, he saw the fear in Elara's eyes. the desperation clinging to her like a shroud. He considered this. Was true justice served by blindly adhering to the letter of the law? Or did it lie in seeking the truth, however elusive it may be? He knew his decision would have far-reaching consequences. One can only piece together the fragments of evidence and pray for wisdom in rendering judgment. A single wrong decision could ignite a fire that would consume his kingdom. The weight of the crown pressed heavily, not just upon his head, but upon his heart. While the common folk imagined a king's life filled with splendor and unchecked desire, the reality was often far more constrained, particularly in matters of the heart. For a medieval monarch, marriage wasn't a sacred union born of love, but a carefully calculated political maneuver. Consider this. A king rarely chose his queen. She was chosen for him, a pawn in the intricate chess game of kingdoms and alliances. The records tell us that King Edward's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine was less about affection and more about consolidating his power in France. Their union, while politically advantageous, was plagued by tension and discord. Such was often the fate of royal couples bound together by duty, not desire. Could genuine affection bloom in such arid ground? One can only piece together fragments of their correspondence, hushed whispers in the corridors of power, to understand the complex tapestry of their relationship. Even the raising of children was a matter of state. Princes and princesses, though born to privilege, were seldom afforded the simple joys of a carefree childhood. They were groomed from infancy for their future roles, future kings, queens, or bargaining chips in the never-ending quest for land and influence. Their education, their companions, even their affections, were all orchestrated to serve the needs of the realm. The king, though a father, was often a distant figure, his time consumed by the demands of his crown. Imagine the king, staring out across the moonlit gardens, the scent of roses heavy in the air, yearning for a connection beyond the confines of his gilded cage. He might steal a quiet moment with his children, a rare glimpse into a life lived beyond the stifling grasp of courtly intrigue. But even these moments were tinged with melancholy, a reminder of the personal sacrifices demanded by his royal duty. And so it was that the king, surrounded by the trappings of power, often found himself profoundly alone. The crown, a symbol of his authority, also served as a barrier, separating him from the simple human connections he craved. The crown, a symbol of his authority, also served as a barrier to intimacy. Marriage, for a king, was rarely a matter of the heart. It was a carefully orchestrated political alliance, a contract drawn up to secure lands, forge alliances, and most importantly, produce heirs. Consider this. The king's bedchamber, a place most imagined to be a sanctuary, was often crowded with witnesses, courtiers ensuring the consummation of the marriage, a stark contrast to the quiet intimacy craved by ordinary men. The queen, herself a pawn in this grand game of power, carried the heavy weight of dynastic expectation. Her worth was measured in the fruit of her womb, her success intrinsically tied to the production of a male heir. Each pregnancy was a public affair, scrutinized by the court, each miscarriage a potential political crisis. The records tell us that the quiet grief of a lost child was often overshadowed by the pragmatic anxieties of succession. Imagine the pressure she endured, the constant fear of failing in her primary duty. And what of the king, caught between his duty to the realm and his genuine affection, however limited, for his wife? Could true intimacy flourish under the relentless gaze of the court, under the weight of such immense pressure? One can only piece together the fragments of their lives through historical accounts, gleaning glimpses of shared moments, hushed conversations amidst the ever-present backdrop of courtly life. Did their hands brush in private moments of shared sorrow? Did they find solace in each other's company, a refuge from the demands of their public roles? These questions linger, unanswered whispers from a world shrouded in both splendor and profound loneliness. The very nature of royal marriage, designed to strengthen a kingdom, often served to isolate those at its heart. And so it was that even the intimate act of raising children was intertwined with the cold calculations of power. Imagine the royal nursery, a place ostensibly of warmth and laughter, yet overlaid with the ever-present awareness of its political significance. These children, born into privilege, were also born into duty. Heirs to a kingdom, pawns in a game of alliances and succession, their very existence a matter of public scrutiny. A medieval king, however doting, could rarely afford the luxury of simply being a father. His time, fragmented and dictated by the demands of the realm, offered only fleeting glimpses into the lives of his offspring. Formal lessons, overseen by carefully chosen tutors, replaced casual moments of parental guidance. State dinners and diplomatic meetings took precedence over bedtime stories and whispered lullabies. Consider this: a young prince, barely old enough to understand the weight of the crown that awaited him, already being groomed for leadership. Surrounded by advisors and courtiers, each with their own agendas, the child navigated a world of whispers and veiled intentions. His playmates, often chosen for their family's political influence, became unwitting participants in the intricate dance of courtly life. The queen, too, faced her own unique challenges. While she might have more direct involvement in her children's upbringing, her role was equally bound by tradition and expectation. Her maternal instincts often clashed with the rigid protocols of the court, the constant pressure to produce heirs, healthy and fit to rule, looming large. The records tell us of royal mothers torn between their desire to nurture and protect their children, and the knowledge that those very children were destined for a life of immense responsibility and potential peril. What kind of childhood could blossom in such a rarefied atmosphere? Did these royal offspring yearn for the simple joys afforded to children outside the palace walls? Did they resent the constant scrutiny, the ever-present weight of expectation? These are questions that continue to fascinate and haunt us, echoes of a world where even the most private of family bonds were subject to the relentless demands of power. And so it was, that even within the gilded cage of royalty, a chilling wind of danger perpetually blew. The very power that a king wielded attracted envy and malice, making him and his family targets for those who sought to usurp the throne, or simply to avenge some perceived wrong. Assassination attempts were an ever-present threat, a constant shadow lurking in the periphery of royal life. Poisoned wine, a blade in the dark, a carefully placed arrow loosed from the crowd. These were not mere stories spun to frighten children, but the grim realities of medieval power. Consider this: a king could never truly relax, never fully trust, even within his own court. Every servant, every advisor, every noble held the potential to be a conspirator or a pawn in a larger plot. Meals were meticulously tasted, chambers rigorously searched, every movement scrutinized for any hint of treachery. The heavy weight of the crown was matched by the constant burden of suspicion. Imagine the psychological toll on a king, forced to live in perpetual fear, to see enemies in every shadow, to question the loyalty of even those closest to him. The records tell us of kings who slept in different chambers each night to confound potential assassins. We hear of complex security protocols, layers of guards, and intricate systems of informants designed to expose plots before they could come to fruition. Yet, despite these precautions, violence often erupted. Royal blood was spilled, lives cut short, and dynasties toppled by the cold hand of treachery. The children, raised amidst such an environment, would have witnessed firsthand the fragility of power, the constant threat of violence, and the ever-present fear that clung to their parents like a shroud. One can only piece together the psychological impact of such an upbringing, the constant awareness of their own vulnerability, and the knowledge that their family's very existence was a precarious balancing act on the knife edge of fate. The records tell us that such a childhood bred suspicion, even paranoia. Imagine young King Louis, barely a man, inheriting the French throne. He understands the weight of the crown, the constant pressure from nobles vying for power, the whispers in dimly lit corridors. He's learned to trust no one completely, not even his own kin. The fear, once a shroud worn by his parents, has become his own cloak. One crisp autumn evening, a grand feast was held in the castle's great hall. The air, thick with the aroma of roasted meats and spiced wine, buzzed with the forced merriment of the court. Louis, seated at the high table, surveyed the room. Each smile seemed strained, every gesture calculated. He picked at his food, his appetite lost amidst the swirling anxieties. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the entrance. A man, dressed in the livery of a visiting lord, lunged forward, a glint of steel flashing in his hand. The guards reacted instantly, swords drawn, but the assassin moved with surprising speed. He pushed past the first line of defense, his eyes fixed on Lewis, a chilling determination etched on his face. Time seemed to slow. The music stopped abruptly. The boisterous chatter died in every throat, replaced by a collective gasp of horror. Louis sat frozen, the enormity of the moment paralyzing him. He watched, as if in a dream, as the assassin closed the distance. Could this be the end? Had the fears of his youth finally materialized into this cold, sharp reality? The polished floor beneath his feet felt suddenly slippery, like the edge of a precipice. The assassin was just steps away, his arm raised. The assassin lunged, but the blow never landed. Royal guards, alerted by the sudden shift in atmosphere, reacted with astonishing speed. The would-be killer was subdued, a tangled mess of limbs and steel, dragged away before Louis could fully process what had transpired. The king, however, was shaken. The incident served as a stark reminder of the fragility of his life, a constant companion even amidst the trappings of power. And it illuminated another grim reality of medieval kingship. Even with all his wealth and authority, Louis's health, like that of any man in his time, hung by a precarious thread. Consider this. The average lifespan of a medieval monarch was considerably shorter than that of his subjects. While peasants toiled in the fields, their simple diet and active lifestyle, ironically, offered a degree of protection against the diseases that ravaged the upper classes. The king, with his rich feasts and sedentary habits, faced different dangers. Overindulgence and lack of exercise took their toll. Gout, obesity, and heart ailments were common royal afflictions. One can only piece together the medical understanding of the time. Bloodletting, a practice believed to balance the body's humors, was a frequent and often debilitating treatment. The records tell us of kings weakened by repeated bleedings, their bodies rendered vulnerable to infections. The very remedies meant to cure often hastened their demise. Louis, like his predecessors, lived under the constant shadow of illness, knowing that even a minor ailment could quickly escalate into a life-threatening crisis. And beyond the physical dangers, there was the relentless pressure of the crown. The weight of the kingdom rested on his shoulders, a burden that took a heavy toll on his mental and physical well-being. Sleepless nights spent strategizing, the ever-present fear of betrayal, and the constant demands of court life eroded his health day by day. The incident with the assassin, though quickly quelled, would no doubt add another layer of anxiety to his already burdened mind. The life of a king, far from being a fairy tale of ease and luxury, was a precarious existence, a constant battle against both seen and unseen enemies. The crown, a symbol of power and prestige, was also a cage. It confined the king, limiting his personal freedoms in ways unimaginable to his subjects. Hunting, often considered a royal pastime, was less a leisure activity and more a political tool, a chance to forge alliances with powerful nobles or demonstrate strength and prowess. One can only piece together fragments of their true interests from historical records. A king might find solace in the quiet study of illuminated manuscripts, losing himself in the artistry and wisdom of ancient texts. Perhaps he had a fondness for music, the haunting melodies of a harp, or the rousing anthems of the court, offering a brief respite from the pressures of his reign. Consider this. Could a king truly indulge in such pursuits without the weight of his responsibilities intruding? Even in moments of supposed leisure, he was always the king. Every conversation, every gesture, was scrutinized, interpreted, and potentially weaponized by those vying for favor or power. Did he genuinely enjoy the hunt, or was it a performance for his court? Did the music truly soothe his soul, or was he simply playing the part of a cultured monarch? And so it was, the king's personal life, like every other aspect of his existence, was dictated by his position. He could not simply choose his companions or pursue his passions freely. Friendships were tinged with political maneuvering, and hobbies were often chosen for their strategic value. The very idea of privacy was a foreign concept. His days were an endless procession of audiences, councils, and ceremonies, leaving little time for personal reflection or genuine connection. The king, it seemed, was forever trapped between the demands of his crown and the longings of his heart, a prisoner in his own gilded cage. What price, then, was true freedom for a man born to rule? The gilded cage extended even to the king's leisure. Consider this: the royal hunt. A pastime, yes. A chance to escape the stifling confines of the court, to breathe the crisp air of the forest, and feel the thrill of the chase. But even here, amidst the ancient trees and the baying hounds, the specter of politics loomed large. The hunt was not simply a recreational activity. It was a carefully orchestrated performance, a stage on which alliances were forged and rivalries played out. The records tell us that invitations to the royal hunt were highly coveted, markers of favor and influence. A nobleman who found himself excluded knew his standing at court was precarious, and those fortunate enough to be included understood the subtle dance of power that unfolded beneath the veneer of camaraderie. Every conversation, every gesture, every kill was meticulously scrutinized for hidden meaning. Was the king favoring a particular lord with his attention? Did he gift a prized stag to a potential rival? These seemingly insignificant details could have profound political ramifications. One can only piece together the anxieties that must have gnawed at those present. Imagine the pressure of maintaining a cheerful demeanor while vying for the king's favor, the constant fear of a misspoken word or a clumsy maneuver that might offend the royal sensibilities. Even the thrill of the chase must have been tinged with a certain tension, the knowledge that every arrow loosed, every hound unleashed, was not just a pursuit of game but a maneuver in the complex game of courtly politics. The forest, meant to be a sanctuary, became another arena for the endless struggle for power. And so it was that even in moments of apparent freedom, the king and those around him remained bound by the invisible chains of their station. The hunt, a symbol of royal privilege, became a poignant reminder of the burdens of power, a stark illustration of the price of kingship. The roar of the crowd was a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of the hunt. Returning to the city, the king traded the rustling leaves for the tapestry of human faces, each a blur of awe and expectation. Parades were a necessary spectacle, a vibrant display of royal power meant to inspire loyalty and awe. He rode through the cheering throngs, his presence a focal point, a shimmering beacon in the heart of his kingdom. Yet, a strange disconnect always lingered. The cheers echoed, but they reached him as if from a great distance. Each face in the crowd, though alight with excitement, remained a mystery. Who were these people truly? What hopes and fears resided behind their carefully constructed masks of deference? He saw their smiles, their gestures of respect, but could he ever truly know them? Could he bridge the chasm that separated his gilded existence from their everyday realities? Ceremonies, too, were a performance. The weighty crown, the elaborate rituals, the pronouncements of law and judgment, all were essential elements of kingship. They affirmed his authority, solidified his position, yet they also built walls. The very symbols of his power became barriers to genuine human connection. He was a figurehead, a symbol, not a man. One can only piece together the king's thoughts as he moved through these elaborate yet isolating rituals. Consider this. Every interaction, every gesture was scrutinized, analyzed for meaning. A casual word could be interpreted as a royal command. A fleeting glance, a sign of favor or disfavor. Spontaneity was a dangerous luxury, authenticity, a near impossibility. The king lived in a gilded cage, surrounded by the trappings of power, yet desperately lonely. He yearned for connection, for genuine interaction, but the very nature of his position made it an elusive dream. The weight of the crown, it seemed, pressed down not only upon his head, but upon his soul. The weight of the crown pressed heavily, yet sometimes, A crack of light pierced the suffocating formality. One sweltering afternoon, while riding out beyond the castle walls, a rare escape from the stifling court, King Edward stumbled upon a scene of unexpected simplicity. A lone farmer, bent double in his field, meticulously tended his rows of burgeoning wheat. The air hung thick with the scent of sun-baked earth and the drone of insects, a stark contrast to the perfumed halls of the palace. Intrigued, Edward dismounted, his retinue hovering nervously nearby. He approached the farmer who, oblivious to the royal presence, continued his work. "Tell me, good man," Edward began, his voice surprisingly gentle, "what brings you such contentment amidst this labor?" The farmer, startled by the sudden voice, straightened up, his eyes widening in recognition. He stammered, dropping to his knees in a hurried bow. "Your Majesty, forgive my ignorance. I did not see you." Fear mingled with awe in his voice. He couldn't comprehend this sudden royal interest in his mundane existence. Edward, with a dismissive wave of his hand, urged the man to rise. "There's no need for such formality," he insisted, a rare smile gracing his lips. He genuinely wanted to understand the life of this man, so different from his own. "Tell me of your life, your worries, your joys." The farmer, still hesitant, began to speak of the constant struggle against the elements, the fear of a poor harvest, the simple joy of providing for his family. He spoke of the community that supported each other, the shared celebrations and sorrows. It was a life of hardship, certainly, but also one of tangible purpose and genuine connection, the very things Edward so desperately craved. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Edward turned to leave. The encounter, brief as it was, left a profound impression. He returned to the castle, the weight of the crown feeling heavier than ever, the gilded cage more confining. He had glimpsed a different world, a world where genuine human connection thrived, a world he could never truly be a part of. The encounter with the farmer lingered in Edward's mind, a stark contrast to the gilded cage he inhabited. The weight of the crown pressed down upon him, not just physically but psychologically. Consider this. To be a king meant to be perpetually on display, a symbol to be venerated, rarely seen as a man. His every word, every gesture, scrutinized and interpreted, shaping the destiny of an entire kingdom. True intimacy became a distant dream. Who could befriend a king without an ulterior motive? Who could offer honest counsel without fear of reprisal? The isolation was profound, a silent erosion of the self. The pressure, too, was relentless. Every decision, from the smallest decree to declarations of war, carried immense weight. The lives of his subjects, the prosperity of the realm, rested squarely on his shoulders. Sleep offered little respite, often punctuated by nightmares of failed harvests, rebellious factions, and encroaching enemies. The burden of responsibility was a constant companion, whispering doubts and fears into his ear. And what of the constant threat of betrayal? The court, a viper's nest of ambition and intrigue, where smiles could conceal daggers and whispered words could topple thrones. Trust became a luxury Edward could ill afford. He learned to be wary, to suspect even those closest to him. The psychological toll was heavy, a slow poison seeping into his very being. One can only piece together the internal struggles of these men, the kings, the emperors, from fragmented historical accounts and the rare, candid entries in personal diaries. He yearned for genuine connection, the simple joys of life he witnessed in the farmer's family. He envied their laughter, their shared burdens, their unburdened existence. But for Edward, such simple pleasures were forever out of reach. He was a king, and the price of his power was a profound and enduring loneliness. The walls of his gilded cage seemed to close in tighter, the weight of the crown ever heavier. The crown, a symbol of power and authority, was also a barrier. It separated Edward from the very people he ruled, creating an invisible chasm between him and genuine human connection. Imagine the echoing halls of his castle, grand and imposing, yet filled with a silence that spoke volumes. Surrounded by courtiers and advisors, each interaction tinged with formality and deference, he was starved for authentic companionship. Every smile felt measured, every word carefully chosen, every gesture performed for an audience. Where could he turn for true solace? To whom could he confess his deepest fears, his most private joys? His confidants were often those who benefited most from his favor, their loyalty intertwined with ambition. The weight of his responsibilities, the burden of his decisions, pressed down upon him, yet he bore them alone. He yearned for the simple camaraderie of equals, the easy banter of friends, the shared laughter that echoed in the village tavern. But for Edward, such experiences were but distant memories, relics of a life he could no longer access. Consider this: a king, surrounded by hundreds, yet utterly alone. He dined on delicacies while his heart hungered for connection. He slept in a lavish bed, yet his nights were often sleepless, haunted by the anxieties of his position. He could command armies, dictate laws, shape the destiny of nations, but he could not command genuine affection. He could not decree true friendship. He could not legislate away the gnawing loneliness that resided deep within his soul. And so it was, the tragic irony of kingship. The more powerful he became, the more isolated he felt, trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. The records tell us little of the emotional toll this isolation took, yet one can only imagine the silent struggle within, the quiet desperation of a king yearning for a connection he could never truly possess. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the tapestries depicting heroic scenes of past kings. But tonight, they offered no solace. Tonight, the weight of the crown pressed down on him, heavier than any physical burden. He stared into the flames, their dance mirroring the turbulent thoughts within his own heart. Had he made the right choices? Had the sacrifices, the alliances forged through marriages devoid of love, the wars waged for land and power, the executions ordered to maintain control, been worth it? He thought of his queen, a woman he respected but did not love, bound to him by duty, not affection. He pictured his children, heirs to the throne, yet strangers to their father, their lives dictated by the demands of lineage and succession. Was this the legacy he desired? A kingdom built on ambition and secured by fear, inherited by children who knew him only as a king, not a man? A sigh escaped his lips, heavy with the burden of his kingship. Consider this. He commanded armies, controlled vast territories, held the fate of countless lives in his hands. Yet, within the confines of his own heart, he was powerless. He could not command love, nor could he purchase peace of mind. The very power that set him apart, that elevated him above all others, was also the source of his profound isolation. One can only piece together the fragments of his inner life through the scant records that remain. They hint at a man wrestling with his conscience, a king grappling with the moral complexities of his position. Did he find solace in prayer? Did he seek guidance from his advisors? Or did he, like so many before him, simply bear the weight of his crown in silent solitude, his inner turmoil masked by the stoic facade of kingship? The flames in the hearth flickered and died down, mirroring the dwindling embers of hope in the king's weary heart. The embers of the king's life faded, but the fires of his reign continued to burn, shaping the landscape of his kingdom for generations to come. His legacy, like the tapestry of his life, was woven with threads of both triumph and tragedy. Consider this: every royal decree, every judgment passed, every war waged, rippled outwards, touching the lives of his subjects in ways both seen and unseen. Did his policies foster prosperity or sow the seeds of discontent? Did his wars secure his borders or leave his people impoverished and grieving? The records tell us of grand cathedrals erected, their spires reaching towards the heavens, monuments to the king's piety, perhaps, or his ambition, but they whisper nothing of the back-breaking labor that brought them into being, the sweat and toil of countless hands. We read of treaties signed, alliances forged, and the delicate dance of diplomacy played out on the grand stage of international relations. Yet history often overlooks the quiet sacrifices made by common folk, the families separated, the fields left fallow as men marched off to fight in the king's name. And so it was. The weight of these decisions, the consequences both intended and unforeseen, ultimately defined the king's reign. Did he leave behind a kingdom strengthened and unified, its people prosperous and content? Or did he bequeath a realm fractured by internal strife, its coffers depleted, its people burdened by the heavy hand of his rule? The true measure of a king's reign, perhaps, is not found in the grandeur of his court or the breadth of his conquests, but in the quiet whispers of his people, the stories they tell of his time, the legacy he etched into the very fabric of their lives. This is the enduring legacy of the king, the mark he left upon the world long after the flickering flames of his life had been extinguished. The whispers turned to shouts in the 5th year of King Alaric's reign. His decision, seemingly minor at the time, to levy a new tax on the wool trade, had unforeseen and devastating consequences. The merchants, once the lifeblood of the kingdom's economy, found their margins squeezed thin. Some swallowed their losses, others sought new markets beyond Alaric's reach. The flow of goods slowed, the markets thinned, and the gold that once flowed freely into the royal treasury dwindled to a trickle. The consequences rippled outwards. The weavers, dependent on the merchants for their raw materials, found themselves with idle looms and empty stomachs. The once bustling workshops fell silent, the rhythmic clatter of shuttles replaced by the cries of hungry children. And so it was, the king's decision, made in the perceived interest of the crown, began to unravel the intricate tapestry of his kingdom. Consider this. A kingdom is not a monolithic entity, but a delicate ecosystem. Each part, from the farmer in the field to the merchant in the marketplace, plays a vital role. Alaric, blinded by his immediate needs, failed to grasp this fundamental truth. He saw only the potential for increased revenue, not the interconnectedness of his realm. He saw the wool, not the people who shepherded the sheep, spun the thread, and wove the cloth. The records tell us that within a year, the once prosperous city of Oakhaven, a major hub for the wool trade, became a shadow of its former self. Its vibrant marketplaces were deserted, its bustling taverns silent. The king's coffers, ironically, remained as empty as the bellies of his people. Alaric's short-sighted decision, made in the cold isolation of his throne room, had plunged his kingdom into the icy grip of economic hardship. One can only piece together the extent of the suffering, the quiet desperation that settled upon the land like a chilling fog. The king's legacy, once poised for greatness, began to take on a darker hue, a stain that would forever mar his reign. King Alaric, haunted by the spectral emptiness of his once thriving kingdom, knew he had erred. The wool trade, the lifeblood of his realm, had withered under his misguided policies. But unlike many rulers before him, Alaric possessed a quality rare amongst the crowned heads of Europe: the humility to admit his mistakes. He repealed the exorbitant taxes, recognizing the crippling effect they had on his merchants. He commissioned new roads, not for his glory, but to facilitate easier trade and travel for his people. He even, much to the shock of his advisors, invited foreign merchants back into his kingdom, offering them favorable terms and safe passage. The effects of these changes were not immediate. The wounds of his previous policies ran deep. Yet, slowly, tentatively, life began to return to the land. The marketplaces, once desolate, began to hum with activity. Merchants, emboldened by the king's newfound pragmatism, cautiously resumed their trade. The rhythmic clatter of looms, long silenced, echoed once more through the towns, a hopeful symphony of renewed industry. And so it was, after a season of hardship, that Alaric's kingdom began to heal. The wool trade, nurtured back to health, flowed like a rejuvenating river through the land. Prosperity, though fragile, returned. The people, initially wary, began to trust their king once more. They saw in him a ruler who, despite his initial missteps, had the courage to correct his course, a quality more valuable than any jewel in his crown. This, however, was not the end of Alaric's story. The shadow of his earlier decisions still lingered. The question remained: Could he truly regain the unwavering trust of his people? Could he secure his legacy, not as a ruler who made mistakes, but as a king who learned from them? Alaric's kingdom, though recovering, was but one piece on a vast, intricate board. Neighboring realms with their own ambitions and anxieties watched his every move. The fragile peace he had brokered within his own borders did little to quell the simmering tensions that existed beyond them. King Edric of Northumbria, a seasoned warrior with a reputation for ruthlessness, eyed Alaric's fertile lands with thinly veiled avarice. To the south, Queen Isolde, known for her cunning diplomacy and vast network of spies, presented a different kind of threat, one of whispers and alliances forged in secret. The records tell us that Alaric, still bearing the scars of his past mistakes, understood the precariousness of his position. He knew that true stability wouldn't come from simply managing his own kingdom, but from navigating the complex web of relationships that bound the realms together. He initiated diplomatic missions, sending envoys bearing gifts and carefully worded proposals to both Edric and Isolde. With Edric, he stressed the mutual benefits of trade and the strength that lay in a united front against common enemies. To Isolde, he offered assurances of non-aggression, proposing a marriage alliance between their respective families. And so it was that Alaric found himself engaged in a constant game of political chess, where every move carried significant weight, every alliance a potential double-edged sword. He learned to decipher the coded messages in diplomatic letters, to read between the lines of flowery pronouncements and veiled threats. He discovered that trust was a currency even more precious than gold, and infinitely harder to acquire. Could he forge alliances strong enough to safeguard his kingdom? Or would he become another pawn in the ruthless games of power played by the rulers around him? The future of his kingdom, and perhaps his very survival, hung precariously in the balance. The grand hall of the French court shimmered with the light of 1,000 candles, reflecting off polished silver and the rich tapestries adorning the walls. King Philip, a man known for his shrewd diplomacy, awaited the arrival of the Duke of Burgundy. This was no mere courtesy call. The duchy controlled vital trade routes, and their alliance was crucial to securing the king's eastern border. The air crackled with anticipation, every courtier a silent observer to the delicate dance about to unfold. And so it was. The Duke entered, flanked by his retinue, a carefully orchestrated display of power. He bowed low before the king, yet his eyes held a glint of defiance. The initial pleasantries, the customary exchange of lavish gifts, masked the true nature of the meeting. A tapestry depicting a famous Burgundian victory served as a not-so-subtle reminder of the Duke's military prowess. The king, in turn, presented a finely crafted chessboard, its pieces made of solid gold, a symbolic gesture emphasizing the strategic nature of their relationship. The negotiations began, each word chosen with the utmost care. The Duke spoke of shared interests, of mutual prosperity, but his demands were steep. He sought increased autonomy, a larger share of the trade revenues. The king listened patiently, his expression unreadable. He acknowledged the Duke's contributions, flattered his ambition, but subtly reminded him of the protection the crown offered. One can only piece together the intricacies of these power plays through the fragmented records that remain, hints and whispers captured in the margins of history. The discussion stretched late into the night, a subtle battle of wills played out under the guise of diplomatic discourse. The future of two powerful entities, perhaps even the fate of the region, hinged on the outcome of this single encounter. What compromises would be made? Would the king secure the vital alliance he so desperately needed? Or would the meeting end in a stalemate, escalating tensions to the brink of conflict? The weight of the crown pressed heavily upon the king's brow as the night wore on. The weight of the crown was more than just the physical heft of gold and jewels. It was the crushing burden of responsibility. The king knew that the pleasantries of courtly diplomacy were often a thin veneer over the brutal realities of power. One wrong word, one misinterpretation, one perceived slight, could shatter the fragile peace and plunge his kingdom into the horrors of war. Consider this. Even a successfully negotiated treaty offered no guarantee of lasting security. Betrayal was as common as courage in the medieval world. Alliances shifted like desert sands, driven by the winds of ambition and self-preservation. The records tell us of kings betrayed by their own brothers, their closest advisors, even their own children. Marriages, often touted as bonds of peace between kingdoms, could become weapons in a complex game of political maneuvering. A queen, sent as a symbol of unity, might become a pawn in her father's schemes, her loyalty divided between her husband and her bloodline. And so it was that a king had to be constantly vigilant, perpetually suspicious, weighing every word, every gesture, every gift, for hidden meanings and treacherous undertones. War, if it came, was a devastating affair, not simply the clash of armies on a battlefield, but the systematic destruction of livelihoods, the ravaging of the countryside, the merciless slaughter of innocents caught in the crossfire. Even victory could be Pyrrhic, leaving the kingdom weakened, its coffers depleted, its people traumatized. The king understood this implicitly. He had seen the aftermath of war firsthand, the smoldering ruins of once thriving villages, the hollow eyes of refugees clinging to the last vestiges of hope. He carried the weight of these memories, the silent screams of his subjects etched onto his very soul. The king's decision, made in the quiet solitude of his chamber, would have consequences that reverberated far beyond the castle walls, shaping the destiny of his kingdom for generations to come. Would he choose the path of peace, fraught with uncertainty and risk? Or would he embrace the grim inevitability of war? The king chose war. The whispers of rebellion, once confined to shadowed taverns and hushed conversations, had grown into a roar. Duke Godfrey, a man whose ambition eclipsed his loyalty, had openly challenged the crown, raising banners of revolt in the northern provinces. The records tell us the king knew the cost of war, the lives lost, the land ravaged, the treasury depleted. Yet he also understood the far greater peril of allowing dissent to fester, to spread like a malignant disease through the body politic. To yield now would not bring peace, only a slow, agonizing disintegration of his authority and ultimately his kingdom. And so it was, on a cold, gray morning, the royal banners were unfurled, the war horns sounded, and the king rode out at the head of his army. The clash at Blackwood Forest, a name now etched in the annals of the kingdom's history, was a brutal affair. The king, clad in full plate armor, fought with a ferocity born of necessity and a deep, simmering rage. He saw his loyal knights fall, their bodies riddled with arrows, their lifeblood staining the frost-covered ground. He heard the screams of the dying, the cries of the wounded, the relentless clang of steel on steel, a symphony of destruction that echoed through the ancient trees. Consider this. For a medieval king, war was not a detached political maneuver, but a visceral, terrifying reality. It was a gamble on a scale almost unimaginable to us today. One can only piece together the thoughts that raced through the king's mind as he surveyed the bloody battlefield. Did he feel a flicker of doubt, a momentary pang of regret for the choices he had made? Or was he consumed solely by the grim determination to prevail, to crush the rebellion and secure his throne, regardless of the cost? The answer, lost to the mists of time, may never be truly known. The outcome of Blackwood, however, would forever define his reign and determine the fate of his kingdom. The victory at Blackwood, hard won as it was, became a cornerstone of the king's carefully constructed public image. The scribes, under royal command, meticulously documented the battle, not as a brutal clash of ambition and desperation, but as a righteous triumph of good over evil. The king, naturally, was cast as the divinely appointed victor, his enemies as treacherous rebels deserving of their fate. Consider this. Every detail, from the king's courageous stand to the supposed miraculous interventions on the battlefield, was crafted to reinforce his authority and legitimacy. And so it was that the official account of Blackwood spread throughout the kingdom. Bards sang of the king's bravery, weaving tales of his unwavering resolve and strategic brilliance. Artists depicted him in glorious illuminated manuscripts, clad in shining armor, a righteous sword raised high against the forces of darkness. These weren't mere artistic flourishes. They were calculated tools of propaganda, shaping the narrative and solidifying the king's hold on power. The reality of Blackwood, with its messy brutality and ambiguous motivations, faded into the background. The king understood the power of perception. He recognized that in a world where literacy was a rare privilege, images and stories held immense sway over public opinion. He knew that by controlling the narrative he could control his kingdom. One can only piece together the whispers of dissent, the murmurs of those who remembered Blackwood differently. These voices, however, were quickly silenced, drowned out by the carefully orchestrated chorus of praise and adulation. The king's image, meticulously crafted and strategically disseminated, became the accepted truth. What was the true cost of this manufactured image? We shall explore that next. The king's carefully constructed image, however, was not his only defense. Beneath the veneer of courtly life, a hidden world thrived, a world of whispers, coded messages, and furtive glances. This was the realm of the king's spies, his eyes and ears in every corner of the kingdom. These individuals, often drawn from the lower nobility or even the common folk, were invaluable. They moved unseen, unheard, gathering information that could make or break alliances, expose conspiracies, or crush rebellions before they could even ignite. Consider this. In a time long before instant communication, information was power, and the king understood this implicitly. His network of informants extended far beyond the castle walls, reaching into the taverns and marketplaces, the merchant guilds, and even the monasteries. Some were paid handsomely for their services, others motivated by loyalty, ambition, or perhaps fear. Their identities were closely guarded secrets, known only to a select few within the king's inner circle. Betrayal, even the slightest hint of it, was swiftly and brutally punished. The records tell us little of these shadowy figures. Their work, by its very nature, was meant to remain hidden, undocumented. One can only piece together fragments of their existence. A cryptic note intercepted, a rumor traced back to its source, a sudden and unexplained disappearance. These whispers, these fragments, hint at a world of intrigue and danger, a world where loyalty was constantly tested, and where the stakes were incredibly high. And so it was, in the king's court, a constant game of shadows played out. The king relied on these whispers in the dark to maintain his grip on power. This constant vigilance, this reliance on secrecy and subterfuge, inevitably took its toll. The king, surrounded by spies, began to see enemies everywhere, real and imagined. Trust became a luxury he could no longer afford, and the very foundation of his reign, built on carefully constructed images and hidden whispers, began to crumble. The whispers turned from rumors of courtly intrigue to hushed pronouncements of sickness. A fever, they said, gripping the poorest quarters of the kingdom. Then, the telltale swellings, the black boils that marked the dreaded arrival of plague. The whispers escalated into panicked cries, the fear palpable even within the fortified walls of the king's castle. One can only piece together the terror of those days from the fragmented records that remain. The king, already isolated by suspicion and the machinations of his court, was now truly alone. His advisors, those who had not already succumbed to the disease, fled. The very fabric of the kingdom, already strained, began to tear. Trade routes closed, villages were abandoned, fields lay fallow. The king, once the symbol of strength and stability, now presided over a dying realm. What choices faced a medieval king in such a dire situation? Consider this. He could attempt to flee, to save himself and perhaps a handful of loyal retainers. He could remain, a beacon of hope, however false, for his suffering people. Or he could succumb to despair, watching his kingdom crumble around him. The records tell us varying tales of how kings responded to such calamities. Some fled, abandoning their people to their fate. Others, driven by a sense of duty or perhaps by a fatalistic acceptance, remained. The impact of the plague extended far beyond the immediate loss of life. It shattered the already fragile social order. It disrupted the economy, leading to widespread famine and further suffering. And it left an indelible scar on the psyche of the survivors. A constant reminder of the precariousness of life and the ever-present threat of unseen forces. The king, whether he lived or died, would forever be marked by the plague years. His reign, once defined by ambition and power, was now irrevocably intertwined with death and decay. What would become of a king, a kingdom, so profoundly altered? The year is 1347. Imagine the king, cloaked not in velvet and ermine, but in a growing unease. Whispers turn to screams as the bubonic plague, the Black Death, sweeps across his realm. The records tell us of swollen lymph nodes, black boils erupting on the skin, a fever that consumed the body within days. One can only piece together the terror that gripped the kingdom, a terror far more potent than any invading army. This wasn't a war of swords and shields, but of invisible enemies, carried by fleas on rats, silently infiltrating castles and hovels alike. The king, despite his elevated position, was not immune. His advisors, his family, his very court, all were vulnerable to the indiscriminate hand of the plague. Consider this: a king, accustomed to commanding armies, now powerless against an unseen foe, watching his subjects die in droves. The plague didn't merely thin the population, it decimated it. Entire villages were abandoned, fields left untended. The feudal system, the very foundation of medieval society, began to crumble. Peasants, facing certain death, fled their obligations. The intricate web of duties and responsibilities that held the kingdom together unraveled thread by thread. And so it was. The king's authority, once absolute, now challenged by the stark reality of survival. The stability of the kingdom, carefully built over generations, teetered on the precipice. The plague wasn't just a medical crisis, it was a political and economic catastrophe. How could a king maintain order when the very fabric of society was disintegrating? How could he inspire loyalty when his own life and the lives of everyone around him hung precariously in the balance? The plague years wouldn't just define a reign. They would redefine the very meaning of kingship. The plague years passed, leaving an indelible mark on the kingdom and its king. But time, that relentless sculptor, continued its work. The king, once a vigorous warrior, now felt the chilling grip of age. His once sharp eyes, accustomed to scanning battlefields and council chambers, now clouded with cataracts. The strong hands that wielded swords and signed treaties trembled with the palsy of time. One can only piece together the inner turmoil of a man accustomed to command, now confronting the undeniable frailty of his own body. The physical decline was only part of the story. Power, like health, proved a fickle companion. Younger rivals, ambitious sons, even trusted advisors, began to subtly test the boundaries of the king's authority. The once clear lines of succession blurred, whispered conversations replacing open pronouncements of loyalty. The king, acutely aware of this shifting dynamic, found himself walking a tightrope between maintaining control and succumbing to the inevitable. And then, there was the looming specter of death. For a medieval king, death wasn't just a personal ending. It was a pivotal moment in the life of the kingdom. It was a time of uncertainty, vulnerability, and opportunity. The records tell us of elaborate rituals surrounding royal deaths, the anointing of the heir, the meticulous preparations for the funeral, the prayers for the king's soul. But beyond the ceremony and the pageantry lay a deeper anxiety. Would the transition be smooth, or would the kingdom descend into chaos and civil war? Consider this. For a medieval king, the ultimate test of his reign wasn't how he lived, but how he died. The legacy of a lifetime could be undone in the turbulent aftermath of his passing. The aging king, increasingly isolated by his infirmities and the machinations of his court, found himself staring into the abyss, contemplating not just his own mortality, but the fate of the realm he had sworn to protect. The whispers started subtly, like the rustling of leaves before a storm. Who would inherit the crown? The question hung heavy in the air, thick with ambition and dread. The king had sons, of course, each with their own strengths and, perhaps more critically, weaknesses. One possessed a warrior spirit, brave and bold, but also rash and prone to anger. Another was a scholar, wise and just, yet lacking the decisiveness needed to command armies and quell rebellions. And a third, the youngest, still a boy, too young to rule, yet old enough to become a pawn in the deadly games of power. The choosing of an heir was never a simple matter. Primogeniture, the right of the firstborn son, often held sway, but it was not an unbreakable law. One can only piece together the anxieties that plagued the king. He knew that his choice would determine the fate of his kingdom, the lives of his people. He envisioned factions forming, alliances shifting, the court splitting into rival camps, each vying for their favored prince. The records tell us of elaborate ceremonies, councils convened, and pronouncements made. But the true drama unfolded behind closed doors, in hushed conversations and furtive glances. The queen, a formidable figure in her own right, exerted her influence, advocating for her preferred son. Powerful nobles whispered in the king's ear, promising loyalty and support in exchange for favors and positions of power. And in the shadows, spies and informants relayed every word, every gesture, every subtle shift in the political landscape. The weight of this decision, the burden of his legacy, bore down on the aging king. He knew that his choice would not only shape the future of his kingdom, but also determine his own place in history. Would he be remembered as the wise ruler who secured a peaceful succession, or the foolish king whose indecision plunged his realm into chaos? The answer, he knew, lay not in the pronouncements he made, but in the hearts and minds of the people he ruled. And so it was that the twilight of his reign became consumed by the all-consuming question of succession. The answer he never truly found. Death, as it so often does, arrived unannounced. Perhaps it was a sudden illness, a fever that burned through his weakened frame. Or perhaps, as whispers would later claim, the weight of his crown finally proved too heavy to bear. The records tell us little of his final moments, veiled as they are in the language of courtly euphemism. One can only piece together the fragments, the hushed pronouncements of the physicians, the frantic prayers of the queen, the growing unease within the castle walls. His passing, however meticulously concealed in its initial hours, sent ripples through the kingdom. Church bells told a mournful dirge, their somber echoes a stark contrast to the vibrant tapestry of life just days before. Consider this. A kingdom is but a reflection of its king. And with the king's light extinguished, the realm seemed to momentarily dim, shrouded in a collective grief. The mourning rituals were elaborate affairs, steeped in tradition and symbolism. His body, adorned in regal finery, lay in state, allowing his subjects a final glimpse of their sovereign. Days of chanting, processions, and solemn ceremonies followed. The air hung heavy with incense and the scent of freshly turned earth as his tomb was prepared. These rituals, however extravagant, served a crucial purpose. They provided a structured outlet for grief, a necessary catharsis before the turbulent waters of transition could begin to rise. And rise they did. The carefully constructed facade of stability, maintained precariously during the king's declining health, crumbled. The succession, the very question that had haunted his final days, now became a gaping void at the heart of the kingdom. The unspoken anxieties, the simmering rivalries, the carefully veiled ambitions, all now surged to the surface. The king's death, more than a personal tragedy, had become a political crisis. The throne, once a symbol of enduring power, now stood empty, a prize waiting to be claimed in the dangerous game of succession. The king's death knell echoed not just through the castle halls, but across the entire realm. The carefully constructed facade of order, already fragile in his waning days, shattered completely. The whispers turned to shouts, the veiled threats to open declarations. The game of succession, once played in the shadows, now erupted into the harsh light of day. The whispers around the king's failing health had become a self-fulfilling prophecy, accelerating the very instability they feared. Now the vultures circled. The royal council, a body designed to advise and support, became a battleground. Factions formed around potential heirs, each vying for control. One can only piece together the frantic negotiations, the hushed bargains struck in dimly lit chambers, the promises whispered and then broken. Loyalty, a currency so valued in life, was now traded freely for power. The king's closest advisors, once united in their service to the crown, found themselves on opposing sides, their ambitions laid bare. The new ruler, often thrust into power unprepared and sometimes unwilling, faced a kingdom teetering on the brink of chaos. Imagine inheriting not a crown, but a crown of thorns. The treasury, often depleted by the late king's wars or extravagances, offered little respite. The nobles, emboldened by the power vacuum, demanded concessions and pushed their own agendas. The kingdom's enemies, sensing weakness, began to test the borders. The records tell us of hastily assembled armies, rushed defenses, and desperate attempts to maintain the illusion of strength. And so it was. The death of a king rarely brought peace. Instead, it ushered in an era of uncertainty, a period of struggle where the very foundations of the kingdom were tested. The question wasn't just who would rule, but whether the kingdom itself would survive the transition. The true cost of a king's death was measured not in tears, but in the instability and upheaval that followed. The whispers now turned to open revolt. The simmering rivalries now erupted into open warfare. The king was dead, long live the king. But at what cost? The crown, a symbol of power, often masked a life of profound difficulty. To be a medieval king was not simply to wear fine robes and command armies. It was to bear the weight of an entire kingdom, a burden that could crush even the strongest of men. One can only piece together the immense pressure they faced, the constant threat of rebellion from within, and invasion from without. Sleep must have been a luxury, punctuated by nightmares of betrayal and defeat. Consider this: every decision, every royal decree had far-reaching consequences. A harsh tax could lead to widespread famine, a misplaced trust could invite treachery. Even acts of piety and charity were calculated moves on the chessboard of power, carefully designed to strengthen the king's position. The records tell us of kings who spent their days in council chambers, poring over maps and treaties, strategizing against both visible enemies and unseen rivals within their own courts. Their nights were often filled with whispered conversations, tense negotiations, and the ever-present fear of assassination. The loneliness at the top must have been immense. Surrounded by advisors and courtiers, yet truly alone in their burden. Who could they confide in? Who could they trust completely? Every smile, every pledge of loyalty had to be scrutinized for hidden motives. Imagine the psychological toll this must have taken. The constant suspicion, the inability to form genuine connections, the fear of vulnerability. And so it was, the life of a medieval king was a paradox. A life of immense power, yet also one of profound constraint. A life of luxury, yet also one of constant threat. A life lived in the public eye, yet shrouded in a deep and inescapable solitude. The crown, glittering with jewels, was in reality a heavy weight, pressing down upon the brow of the wearer, a constant reminder of the immense responsibilities and the perilous nature of kingship itself. The king was dead. Long live the king. But was it a life anyone would truly envy? Was it a life anyone would truly envy? Consider this. A king might feast on roasted swan and sip imported wine, but he also faced the constant threat of poison in his cup. He might command armies and dictate laws, but he was also bound by tradition, by the whispers of advisors, and the ever-present threat of rebellion. He might sleep in a feather bed beneath tapestries woven with gold, but he also rested uneasily, knowing that enemies both within and without his kingdom plotted his downfall. The records tell us of kings who died young, victims of disease, assassination, or the battlefield. We hear tales of those driven mad by the pressures of their position, isolated by their own power. Imagine the weight of every decision. The knowledge that a single misstep could cost thousands of lives, could plunge the kingdom into war. Imagine the burden of knowing that your every word, every action, was scrutinized, dissected, and interpreted, often by those with their own agendas. One can only piece together the fragments of their lives from chronicles and court records, glimpses into a world both magnificent and terrifying. We see the grand ceremonies, the opulent displays of wealth, the pronouncements of power. But what we often miss are the quiet moments, the moments of doubt and despair, the moments of crushing loneliness that even a king could not escape. The crown, a symbol of authority, also served as a barrier, separating the man from his humanity. And so, as we stand before the tomb of a long-forgotten king, gazing upon the effigy of a man who once commanded nations, we are left with a haunting question. Was the price of power worth the burden it carried? Was the gilded cage of kingship a life truly lived, or merely an elaborate performance played out on the grand stage of history?